Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I want to start by giving you a little bit of an idea about Department of Social Services. Many of you know us mostly from reading about us in the newspaper. What I wanted to do is to start by talking to you a little bit about the fact that the agency, in many ways, folks don't understand the scope of it, and also the task that we have at hand. Hopefully, if I can move us forward here. And then obviously one of the things that I want to do in my short presentation is to talk to you about the connection between child welfare and education, because there's a huge connection in particular between abuse and neglect in early childhood education, and I want to try to make that case for you as we talk. But I want to start by just telling you that Department of Social Services is a huge agency, 4,000 employees, $792 million that comes through that agency. And we have three core functions. Now, most of you know of us by hearing about what we do in the area of child abuse and neglect. So when you look at Strong Families, that really depicts everything that we do that has to do with the investigation and taking care of children that have been abused or neglected. But what a lot of folks don't know is that we also have that same function for vulnerable adults. So we are also the state agency charged to work with vulnerable adults, and that's anybody from 18 to wherever, that cannot take care of themselves, and they have to be court-ordered to be in our care. But if an adult is disabled in some way and cannot take care of themselves, they can be court-ordered to come in our care, and we oftentimes have to act in loco parentis for older folks as well as for children. So when you look at what we do with children, again, with child abuse and neglect, it ranges from everything from investigation to taking children in custody with the family court and law enforcement, to foster care, which again, most folks know us by. And then the ultimate thing that we look at is permanency for children. So what we also do is adoption. And what we say at DSS all the time is that the happiest day we have at DSS is adoption day. There's really nothing quite like it, to find that permanent family for a child that's been abused or neglected, and to see the joy for both of the parents and also the children. Then the second thing that we do is provide economic assistance. Now again, you may be familiar with the fact that we do that, and I'll use some old acronyms that we really don't use anymore. But for instance, we provide food assistance, which many of you may know as food stamps. We also provide economic assistance to families that are below poverty. Again, our acronym for that is TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. We also regulate child care centers, so we provide licensure of child care, and I'll talk about that in a minute, in particular, how that relates to early childhood education. And then the third picture I have here is we work in child support. So again, we are known for the collection of child support, and we do collect quite a bit of it from fathers, sometimes from mothers across the state. But we also have fatherhood initiatives. So one of the big things that DSS is mandated to do is not only collect child support so that families will be more stable, but also to help provide forums for fathers to be more engaged, not just financially with their children, but also emotionally and physically with their children. So we do quite a bit on this, and I'll highlight the degree to which we do this in just a few slides. I promise I won't share too many statistics. I just want to start by telling you that we touch, our agency touches 1 in 4 South Carolinians. We have a huge impact in this state, 1.2 million folks per year. And the way we touch them, I mentioned child abuse and neglect. If you just see a little bit of the statistics there, we take in about 19,608 cases each year, but of those, about a third of those are actually founded. And what founded means in DSS language is it means that after an investigation, we determined that indeed there was child abuse and neglect that occurred. And when we find that out, then we accept that case and it goes into either foster care or one of our other programs. So we take in a lot more cases than we found, but the founding of a case is a very big part of what we do at DSS, is to do the investigation and to find out whether or not that case actually did happen. We serve with food assistance, or SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We serve 382,000 households per month. $101 million and 809 people. 809,000 people. When you look at financial assistance, or TANF, we serve 27,000 people per month, and most of these are children. In other words, we're providing economic assistance to parents, but the money also is targeted to the children that are in that household. When you look at child care, one of the very big pushes that we have in our agency, and one of the things that we're mandated to do, is to try to provide subsidies for child care so that folks that are on assistance can provide child care for their children. And we give subsidies at the level of 24,550 children. The reason that's particularly important is that the old mindset around welfare was that, you know, people could stay on welfare for years and years and years and not get off. That's changed. It's one of the biggest misconceptions, actually, about social services. The federal law requires, and we are required to move folks off of assistance and help them get work. And when they do get jobs, one of the biggest things that you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to be able to then put their children in child care, because once they do get jobs, then they've got to pay for child care oftentimes. So being able to help them get subsidies to child care is a very big part of what DSS has to do when we get federal dollars to try to support that process. And then in terms of child support, again, our fatherhood engagement is one of our big focuses. We work with the South Carolina Center for Children and Families, Fatherhood and Families, to try to do a lot of work on fatherhood engagement. But in collections alone, I just wanted to put up one statistic. Last year, we collected $290 million. That's a massive effort. The typical caseload for a child support worker in South Carolina is 692 parents, which again is a very big issue that we've got to resolve in our agency. Now, I bring that all up because I want to try to connect this in some way to education. And I want to just see if I can illustrate for you the connections that all make this a very real thing for children that are abused and neglected. Because what ends up happening for the most part in our system, the people that come to our attention, is that all the things that I described all connect with cycles of abuse and neglect. So if you have a family who does not have food, healthy food and nutrition, if you have a family that does not have the folks that don't have jobs and they're not bringing in dollars, if they're uneducated, if their children are not receiving education, if they are divorced oftentimes, if they're single mothers or single fathers, and if there's drugs or violence in their families, you see those cycles and those connections happening over and over again, especially in families that come in our care. It's not unusual at all to see a child that comes in for abuse and neglect whose parents were also abused or neglected. In fact, it's more common than not. And so one of the big focuses that we have is that when you start talking about how is it that you work with children that are abused and neglected, you can't just get at working with the victim. You've got to work with the parent. You've got to work with schools. You've got to work with the economy in terms of trying to provide them the support system that they need. You've got to work on issues regarding domestic violence. You've got to work on drug abuse. If you look at the number one connector with child fatalities in this state, a lot of folks don't realize this. I don't see child fatalities that don't have drugs involved in them. It's a parent oftentimes who's abusing drugs. Sometimes it's a parent that is under the influence and a child dies because of unsafe sleep. But there are oftentimes connections between those things. And education in particular is one thing that really does connect oftentimes to the number one referral that we get at DSS for folks. The number one referral is not abuse, it's neglect. And that's the number one reason why children come into our care. So we're looking at family cycles of abuse, and you're looking at a very complicated job, because what you're trying to do in an agency, a child welfare agency, is you're trying to work and be able to provide a better family for children oftentimes, but you start with trying to keep that child in their biological family and trying to work with them so you don't have to remove them from care. In order to do that, you've got to work with everything that that parent didn't get, everything that those parents are not doing well. If the parent is uneducated, if the parent doesn't have a job, if the parent is drug and alcohol addicted, you've got to work on that as well, because otherwise the child's not going to be able to remain in the home. Then, if you're not able to get the family to stabilize, then you've got to look at who could that child live with. And we do something right now in DSS a lot of is we have a big emphasis on kin caregivership. So what we mean by that is if there is a member of the family that's willing to take that child in and you can keep that child with their siblings and in their biological unit, you're asking grandmother and grandfather and aunt and uncle, would you be willing to take care of this child so the child doesn't have to go in foster care? We just got passed this year some subsidies to be able to give subsidies to kin caregivers, the same that you could give to a foster parent. Because a lot of folks would like to take children in, but they can't because they can't afford to do it. So we have to break cycles. And we have to break cycles not just as an agency, but we have to partner with lots of people that do prevention work. We partner with Children's Trust, with First Steps, with a lot of agencies to be able to do a lot of the work that really gets at how do you stabilize families. Because our goal is to get permanency for children. We want them to be in a permanent home and not to move from home to home. And that's one of the things that we work very hard to do. So in terms of the fact that neglect is our number one referral, I don't have that statistic up here, but it's about 70% of the referrals we get are for neglect. You're looking at the typical perpetrator of neglect is a woman. She's more often white than a minority, and 75% are in their 20s and 30s. So your typical perpetrator of neglect in South Carolina is a single woman, white female, and a young woman who has no support system. And oftentimes neglect, again, is the reason why she has either been neglected herself in her life or she brings a cycle of neglect to her children. And I just put this slide up, which reminds me very much of what we were just talking about in terms of early development. If you just look at the brain of a 3-year-old and you look at the brain of a normal child and then one that's had extreme neglect, there's so much research to basically indicate that neglect in particular can have a devastating impact on children. And under the age of 5 in particular, even though trauma and abuse is also equally traumatic in terms of a lot of the what it perpetuates in a child's life, neglect is absolutely the number one thing that we look at in terms of how is it that we can help families get out of a cycle of neglect and abuse, and how is it that we can really look at the deficits that a child will inherit if they haven't been reading, if they haven't been talked to, if they haven't been cuddled, if they haven't received all of those different things that children need. And so neglect is an extremely, unfortunately, powerful predictor of problems for a child in the future. And then, of course, you hear a lot about domestic violence. South Carolina, unfortunately, is near the top of the list in the state in terms of our rates of domestic violence. But it's staggering to think that 4 out of 5 families repeat domestic violence. Again, this whole notion of neglect and abuse, we need to always remember this, not just children oftentimes that are traumatized just because they've been abused, it's also because they witnessed it. And their witnessing abuse of their parents and others in the home is just as traumatic as if they were abused themselves. So children that are caught in these cycles, again, will have major deficits as they get older. And South Carolina, unfortunately, is near the top of the heap in terms of that issue. Now, I always have a hard time talking about DSS without really just sounding bleak. Because what we do is so serious. It really is. It's so serious. And I have to tell you, as a director of an agency of this size, there's nothing like waking up in the morning and knowing that even on the worst day that you ever have, you will make so much impact on a child. We have that much impact on children. So it's a terrific responsibility, but it's also a terrific challenge. And our department works very, very hard to try to keep our heads above water right now. And if you read about us in the paper, you know that we have tremendous challenges, caseloads and turnover and all kinds of things. But one of the things I just want to bring up to you is the fact that we understand completely that it's that first 5 years of a child's life where we really have to focus. We've got to really pay a lot of attention to what happens with children when they're very young, because it does imprint them for life. And our responsibility is to try to try to interrupt cycles of abuse. Well, that 5-year-old is somebody that we really look at very, very seriously. And a lot of what we try to do, even in permanency, is we try not to let children linger in foster care so that they do get a permanent home, again, during this period of time in which they are so imprintable. So, of the 29,000 kids we serve every year, 41% of them are under the age of 5. So we have this tremendous responsibility, not just to take children into our custody, but we have to really focus on them. And we just understand that it's during this period of time that we really got to make the best strides. We do that through a lot of prevention efforts. We do that through working with other agencies that we feel like really do it better than we do. Because our arm of it, unfortunately, is when children are in trouble. But we try to work with education. We try to work with prevention, with social service agencies, with community nonprofits, to try to make our focus on prevention, because again, we know that this child will end up being a parent one day too. And we want to break those cycles. One of the things that we say all the time is that every moment counts and every single interaction with that child matters. So we have to be really serious and dedicated to making sure that the programs that we use, that they work. I'm very focused on making sure that we get good outcomes out of our programs that we use. And we want to make sure that children really are getting the benefit. And it takes a lot of work to really figure out whether or not what you're doing is making an impact. And we're doing a process right now through our OA agency where we're just going through and looking at our core functions, and we're trying to make sure that everything that we do has some impact. And if it doesn't, then we don't want to do it anymore. And we want to do things that we know are really going to work. So one of the things that we do, you'll hear some about First Steps later. We partner with First Steps to try to provide training and education in our child care centers, in addition to the fact that in child care, what we're trying to do is, make sure that children are fed appropriately, and we're trying to make sure that they're supervised. But we also are trying to make sure that they learn, and that they learn well, that they have technology they need, and that they really can become more educated earlier and earlier. We partner with Head Start. We partner with lots of folks to be able to focus on this young child, because we really believe that focusing on the young child will have a major payout later. And I just want to end by telling you one brief story. I've had the privilege of working in a lot of programs. One of the programs that is probably always struck me as being a complete synthesis of what I was just talking about is a program that we run called New Horizons Family Center, and it's in a town named Somerton, South Carolina. I don't know if any of you ever vacation on Lake Marion, but Somerton is on the shores of Lake Marion. But it's a program that I worked with when I was in Clemson, and ironically DSS funds it. So you can imagine I've made it even better. And it's a program where we take girls that have been in foster care, and they've gotten pregnant while they were in foster care. They've had their babies, and in the past what would happen is the baby would go into foster care, and the girl was already in foster care, and then they would not be reunited. So what we did was we created a program where we would bring them together, and we would take a 16-year-old girl or 15-year-old girl and her baby, and if she wanted to keep that baby, we would work with them for a number of years until she was able to leave with a job, with a home, and not go back to the home that she came from. It is a wonderful program, but it was a wonderful program for me to work in. But one of the things that I still always picture even on a bad day at DSS, when I'm dealing with legislators, and when I'm, I can say that because the legislation with the session just ended. But when things are really sort of just rocking and rolling, one of the things I always remember is this vision that we had of creating a reading room for the babies, for the toddlers. And one of the things that was so touching to me was we would try to encourage these girls to read to their children. And it was so poignant because, those of us that have lived, a fairly good life and have had supportive parents, you just don't think about that as a big deal. And to see a teenager struggle to read to her child, it's really just something that it still hits me. It just hits me right here. To think about if she didn't get that, if she didn't get that kind of, that kind of attention and that kind of support from her parents, what a gift it is for her to give it to her child. And for them to struggle with it. I can remember we had a mural where we had a tree painted on the wall. And I remember, and it was, you were supposed to sit under the tree and read to your child. And I remember one of the girls just sitting there with her baby, and she looked up at me at one point and she said, "I just never thought I'd like Goodnight Moon." And she said, but about the 8th time I read it, I finally got it. And of course, her child would just be sitting there just adoringly looking at her. But it's just that whole idea that we take for granted that children know these things, that they've had that kind of care, that they've had that kind of attention. And to see them understand the power of words and the power of touch and what that does for their children is just a remarkable way to see that legacy and that cycle broken. And we had an absolute 100% success rate. But it was because we took the time and it took lots and lots and lots of work for teenagers to learn how to be good moms, but also for them to become independent and be able to leave. And we had, when I say we were successful, what I mean is that none of these babies did not leave with their moms. So in other words, they went with their mother and stayed with their mother afterwards. And I tell you, at the end of one of my days, that's a great story. That's a great story. So I want to close by just telling you that this work is very serious, but at the same time, this work is very heartwarming and uplifting, and we do see success. But what we really concentrate on every single time we look at a child is we concentrate on what kind of parent that child is going to be, because we know better than any agency that it's cycles and intergenerational cycles that you have to break. So I really applaud the work that folks do in early childhood education, love the partnerships that we have, and we'll continue to make sure we focus on future generations. Thank you.